Good evening. I think we can slowly start our proceedings. I'm sure there will be some more people joining in, but we'll try to start our proceedings here. So a very warm welcome from me. I'm Susanne Oberhausen, for those who don't know me. I'm the head of the European Parliament office here in London. We share this building here with a delegation, the EU Embassy, and we are also having our friends from the Ukrainian Institute here with us, and we are very happy that we can cooperate with you on this, and we are also very happy to host Maria from time to time in our office. So Ukraine has been in the news this year for all the wrong reasons. We all know the situation, Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine, and the suffering and the destruction it inflicted on its people. It created the worst humanitarian and a security crisis in Europe on a scale unseen since the Second World War. And Ukraine has responded in a very brave and resolute manner, and the EU has stood in solidarity. Tonight's event, that we are very happy to co-organize with you, is on the very important subject, tackling Ukraine fatigue in the media. And we are very honored to welcome two very special guests here, Olga Tokariuk, an expert in the field, a journalist, independent journalist, a fellow at the Reuters Institute for the studying of journalists in Oxford, and a non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you.
And Olesya Khromeychuk.
Perfect, thank you.
I tried to do that, but sorry. The moderator for this discussion, Olesya, is the director of the Ukraine Institute in London, a historian and writer who has taught and written about the history of East Central European history at various universities here in the UK, has published books, and most recently this year, The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister, which just came out. The European Parliament is a firm supporter of human rights and the rule of law, and awards the yearly Sakharov Prize for freedom of thought to recognize those who stand up for those shared values. And in 2022, this prize was awarded, and the official ceremony will take place in December in Strasbourg, to the brave people of Ukraine, represented by their president, elected leaders, and civil society. When the decision was made to award this prize, our president of the parliament, President Metsola, announced that, and I quote here, this award is for those Ukrainians fighting on the ground, for those who have been forced to flee, for those who have lost relatives and friends, for all those who stand up and fight for what they believe in. I know that the brave people of Ukraine will not give up, and neither will we. So with that, I'll happy to hand over to Olga and Olesya.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susanne Oberhausen. Thank you, European Parliament Liaison Office, for hosting us tonight, for working with us in partnership on this event. The topic of Ukraine fatigue, I think, cannot be more important than it is now. Today, over 100 missiles were launched by Russia all over Ukraine. So it's just a reminder that Ukraine appears in the news every time something horrendous like today happens. But of course, something terrible happens every day in Ukraine, or it appears in the headlines outside of Ukraine when places like Kherson are liberated. So it's either really bad news or improvements in the situation in Russia's war in Ukraine that bring Ukraine back to our attention. But of course, we need to keep the focus on Ukraine, especially now, especially throughout this really difficult winter. And that is something that we'll be discussing today, among other things, because we've got such a fantastic speaker today who is more than qualified to talk about more or less anything related to Ukraine. And I'm going to introduce you at length now. Suzanne's already done a brief introduction, but I would like to mention all of your roles so that our audience knows them as well. So Olga Tokariuk, our speaker today, is an independent journalist, fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, and non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Her professional interests include international relations and disinformation research. Olga has vast experience working with Ukrainian and international media. Her reports were published and aired by Time, The Washington Post, The Daily Beast, the BBC, Monocle, and many other outlets in the UK, in the USA, Spain, Italy, and elsewhere in the world. She is a former head of foreign desk, news desk at the independent Ukrainian Khromeychuk TV. Olga has also worked on several disinformation research projects and was the lead author of Mythos Lab's reports on Russian disinformation and propaganda related to the invasion of Ukraine, which were featured on the BBC, Le Monde, Huffington Post, Newsweek, and other major outlets. She's a former scholar of the digital Sherlock's program at the Atlantic Council DFR Lab, and she holds an MA in Political Science and International Relations from the University of Bologna and an MA in Journalism from the Taras Shevchenko University in Kyiv. So once again, welcome, Olga. Welcome to this discussion. I would like to begin immediately with the topic of our today's event, Ukraine fatigue, war fatigue. And I'd like to begin by saying that I personally distinguish between war fatigue and Ukraine fatigue. I think war fatigue is inevitable. It affects us all. It affects people inside the country as well. Living through mass bombardment, living through now absolutely regular blackouts in Ukraine is tiring. Managing your life, managing your daily life while suffering through active war is difficult. And it also affects us outside of Ukraine because we get immune to images of war after looking at them, whether that's in Ukraine or elsewhere, after looking at them for several months. Ukraine fatigue, on the other hand, is something else. I believe that it is a consciously chosen weapon of war, chosen by the Kremlin, used rather effectively, that is directed at us here in the West, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Washington, you name it. Its purpose is to draw our attention away from what is actually happening in Ukraine, to make us preoccupied with the problems that we are facing: rising energy prices, cost of living, fears of nuclear war, and so on, and not make the connection necessarily between our concerns and the fact that they are caused by the Kremlin as well. And it exacerbates war fatigue. So Ukraine fatigue exacerbates war fatigue. Would you agree with this distinction? And if you do agree with it, what would you say are the strategies of fighting this Ukraine fatigue? And here I mean both short-term strategies, but also long-term strategies as well.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, it's working. Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be speaking in this beautiful historic building, as we had a chance to find out just before this event started. Thank you all for coming, for your interest in Ukraine. And I think the fact that you are here today means that there is no Ukraine fatigue yet. I hope so. As Olesya, you rightly said, the days like today actually they remind the world that the war in Ukraine is still going on, because there are these news today of massive bombardment, which are said to be on a much larger scale than even those of 1 month ago on October 10th. So Russian bombardments all over Ukraine, targeting infrastructure, energy infrastructure, but also targeting civilian objects, like several residential apartment blocks in Kyiv were hit, and there are civilian casualties. So again, Russia is losing on the battlefield, and it's taking revenge on Ukrainian population by trying to kill civilians, just randomly kill civilians in their homes. and also trying to deprive Ukrainians of electricity, of basic needs, of water supply. I just had a call with my parents before coming here from Oxford. We talked while I was at the train station, and they said that they do not have neither electricity nor water, and they are based in the west of Ukraine, so in the area that is relatively safe, that is not so often targeted by Russians as other parts of Ukraine, but it is also affected. So all parts of Ukraine are affected, and the situation is getting worse progressively as the winter approaches. Of course, we are very concerned of how the winter will go on and how civilians in Ukraine will be able to survive this winter in the situation of constant blackouts, and we don't yet know how the heating supply will be ensured, and the winters in Ukraine are notoriously cold. Unlike here, from what I'm being told, because I've just been in the UK for 2 months, so I didn't have a chance to experience the English winter yet. Summing up, the days like today, they return Ukraine into the front pages. Ukraine will probably be again in the newscasts this evening in various countries. And several days ago, there was another reason why Ukraine was again back into news. It's because Kherson has been liberated, a crucial city in the south of the country that has been under Russian occupation for 8 months, but where people expected Ukrainian military to return. So they were waiting for all these months, those people who stayed in the city, because many of them left. And by some estimates, actually, the population of the city has shrunk by 1/4 of what it has been prior to the Russian occupation. But those remaining in Kherson, those Ukrainians, most of them were waiting for the Ukrainian military to return. And we've seen all those very moving and touching scenes of people hugging, Ukrainian soldiers hugging foreign journalists who reached the city.
Finding flags, digging out flags that were hidden underground.
Exactly. Those scenes of a woman, who was like digging out the flag that she hid under a tile in a pavement tile. And saying, well, my dear flag, something like that. She said, you're wet, but still
But you're
good,
alive.
But
She said, but you're alive.
Yeah, super, of course, moving, touching scenes that transmit this incredible resistance and resilience of Ukrainians and their loyalty to Ukraine. And also, of course, highlight how wrong Russia was to expect that Ukrainians would welcome Russian soldiers with flowers, or somehow would not care, or would at least, pose maybe no resistance, show no resistance. So again and again, Ukrainians are proving Russia wrong. Again and again, Ukrainians are impressing the world with their spirit, with their creativity, with their resilience. And I think, that's actually what is also crucial and central to this issue of fatigue. People in Ukraine cannot afford to have war fatigue. They are tired, as all human beings, but I think there is a distinction between being tired, because, well, of course it's tiring to live in, the situation of constant air raid alerts. I stayed in Ukraine for 7 months after the full-scale invasion began, and of course it was tiring to hear air raid alerts daily, and to have to spend nights in the basement. My daughter spent more than one night in the basement, so she also went through this experience. This is, of course, tiring. But I think the underlying feeling, it never changes, despite of how many nights you have to spend in the basement, despite of how many air raid sirens you hear. And the underlying feeling is that we cannot accept this. It is unacceptable what Russia is doing in Ukraine. The attempt to occupy Ukraine, the attempt to grab Ukrainian sovereign territory, and then, of course, after the Russian retreat from the territories that were under occupation in the north in April, we've all seen what Russians have done there. The massive human rights violations, possible war crimes and crimes against humanity, mass executions of civilians, torture chambers, cases of rape and other horrible crimes. And this is happening all over Ukrainian territory, where Russia was present for some period of time. And I'm afraid we are bound to uncover more horrors from the deoccupied, region of Kherson in the next days and weeks. So because of all this, Ukrainians do not feel the fatigue, and they are not changing their determination. Their determination to resist Russia doesn't change. Their determination to preserve their own country, democratic, free, sovereign Ukraine, doesn't change. And I think you are right that Russia, of course, is trying to exploit and manipulate the issue of fatigue, whether it's war fatigue or Ukraine fatigue in the West, because it knows that it cannot actually change anything in the spirit of Ukrainians, because the more Russia launches missiles on Ukraine, the more it launches recently also these Iranian-made drones and artillery shellings that are happening in Kharkiv, for example, from across the border, or in the north of Ukraine, in the Chernihiv, Sumy region from across the border with Belarus. So all this is happening daily, but it only strengthens the Ukrainians' resolve to resist and to fight until victory, because that's what Ukrainians are fighting for, not until some abstract peace deal is made, which many fear would not guarantee everything, because Russia notoriously violates every deal that it has ever signed. So Ukrainians are fighting until their victory, until the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and until, of course, Russia pays some price for this aggression, until there is justice for the victims and survivors of its crimes. So Russia is trying to exploit and manipulate the concept of fatigue, mostly abroad, mostly in other countries, in its attempt to undermine support for Ukraine, in its attempt to somehow change the public opinion.
And push towards concessions as well.
Yeah.
Push Ukraine towards concessions.
And push other governments that are now supporting Ukraine, to maybe apply pressure on Ukraine to move into some negotiations, which would be premature at this stage, which Ukrainian officials are underlining daily. And today, Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister, again said that there could be no negotiations at this stage. And most experts also agree that this is absolutely not in Ukraine's interest at this moment, because Ukraine is having the dominance on the battlefield. Ukraine is winning on the battlefield. So it's not in Ukraine's interest to freeze the conflict, because it will only give time for Russia to regroup and launch a new attack. So definitely Russia is trying to kind of sow this, sow doubts, sow some, also using disinformation, using various influence campaigns to undermine this Western unity, if we are speaking about the Western world. And of course, Russian disinformation is also functioning quite efficiently in the global south. More, at least it works better than in the West, because in the West, in my opinion, Russian propaganda and disinformation campaigns have largely failed.
Perhaps we'll come back to the strategies of how we can continue to tackle this all together, because it affects us here. How do we maintain that determination to support Ukrainian victory and to ensure that it happens sooner rather than later, and that the peace is lasting and it also comes with justice and so on? How do we ensure that it's as powerful, or as powerful as it is possible outside of Ukraine as it is inside Ukraine, and that solidarity lasts? Maybe there will be also suggestions from the floor here too. We will have a discussion, a Q&A from the floor in a minute. We'll just exchange a few more questions between us before we open the floor. I'll ask you something else related to information and explaining Ukraine to the world. You've been one of the most prominent voices in the English-speaking world before the full-scale invasion, but especially since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. I've suddenly learned a lot from listening to you, and I'm sure a lot of our members of the audience have done as well. Do you think that the misconceptions about Ukraine are fewer now? Have you noticed improved knowledge? What were the hardest misconceptions to deal with, but also what misconceptions still remain and you still have to explain them?
I can answer your first question about what should we do with these Russian attempts to, sow fatigue and somehow exploit this tiredness and the fact that audiences might be getting used to the images of war. So as a journalist, of course, because I'm first of all a journalist, you know, I'm asking myself this question, and I've been actually invited to participate in various events focused on how do we avoid war fatigue, I think since May, so it's been 4 months that this issue has been discussed already. And, you know, in fact, I think it's similar as with disinformation, that because we were aware that Russia would be, you know, sowing disinformation, it would be using propaganda against Ukraine, somehow. And again, I'm speaking here about the West. The rest of the world is a bit a different story. So the Western audiences and the Western societies were somehow prepared to what was coming, and you know, and they showed the resilience. And this disinformation campaigns, they largely failed. And I think it's the same or similar with also the war fatigue, and you know, an attempt to kind of tire and wear off the population, the societies in the West, and kind of make them question support for Ukraine. I think these efforts are mostly failing. Of course, there are now some debates in the US, of course, in the Republican Party about how should we continue supporting Ukraine. But as far as, well, we can say at this stage, it looks like that support will continue, that these voices are not too prominent, so they are not getting, you know, the upper hand. And yes, they are heard more than some months ago, but still there is a consensus, a bipartisan consensus, to continue supporting Ukraine. So in my opinion, this attempt to, you know, use fatigue as a weapon, hybrid weapon against Ukraine, is largely failing. But what we can do somehow to keep the focus on Ukraine as journalists, myself as a journalist, I think, well, first is to keep telling human stories, to speak about the people. This is not about a piece of land, you know, this war is not about just a land grab, and it will not be solved if Ukraine agrees to give Russia some part of its territory, because this war, it is not about a piece of territory. At the center of this war is Russian imperialist ideology, it's imperialist vision of Ukraine as of well, artificial state which just doesn't have a right to exist, and which also poses a threat somehow to the existence of Russia in its current form, because Ukraine is a democracy. Ukraine has had at least 2 popular revolutions. Ukraine has had free elections for the past more than a decade, fair and free, and this was concluded by international observers. Ukraine has a very diverse media scene, vibrant civil society. Ukrainians can protest freely when they do not like the government, the actions of the government. So all the things which do not exist in Russia, and this of course represents an existential threat to Russia from the point of view of Putin and his regime. And you know, they are saying that Ukraine is anti-Russia, and that's what they mean by that Ukraine is a democracy, Russia isn't. So this war is about that, and you know, at the center of it, and at the center of this Ukrainian resistance are the people, and telling their stories, telling the stories of their resistance, of course, the stories of their suffering as well, of the losses, but at the same time, incredible stories of everyday people, because this resistance effort, it is not led in Ukraine by the army. It is not led by the government, as some people, well, I think maybe not in this country, but in some other countries might erroneously believe that, well, it's just the government and the people, there might be some discrepancy between the ideas and the vision of the government and the people. But no, it's really an effort that encompasses all strata of Ukrainian society, in which people participate in a very grassroots level. It's, you know, coming from fundraising initiatives, donations for to support Ukrainian army or to support civilians on deoccupied territories. Now I'm seeing in the past days a lot of, you know, fundraising for Kherson region, for people who've been there under occupation for months, and they didn't sometimes have access to basic necessities such as, I don't know, like the for children, to formula and to, you know, like things for the babies. So there is this grassroots resistance effort at every level in the Ukrainian society, and I think this is what makes also this war remarkable, and Ukrainians remarkable. And this is what I, as a journalist, you know, I'm trying to tell the stories of these people, to keep the attention on the human stories, on the stories of resistance, and also another aspect which I think is very universal, because this is something that people in many countries can relate to, and it goes beyond the West, and it goes beyond also, I think, the concept of democracy, which might sound not as appealing to, I don't know, some audiences in the global south, or people who have their own colonial grievances against the West. And this is the concept of human rights, that human rights are universal, and that violations of human rights are unacceptable, that no one has a right to come to another person's house and torture this person, put this person in a secret prison, or without any trial, execute a person. So these are all the things that Russia have been doing and is continuing to do on the occupied territories of Ukraine, and this is unacceptable, and this is something to which I think people in most of the countries can relate, and that can help to overcome and keep Ukraine in the focus, to speak about human rights violations, and that they are unacceptable, that they cannot be allowed to continue. So sorry, I'm
not
speaking
at all.
too much. It
Not
was
at all,
just
not
one
at all.
question.
It's very
there was another
useful.
one.
It's exactly what we hoping to hear from you here, and I'm so glad to also say that remarkable work that is being done inside the country in Ukraine, specifically recording instances of violation of human rights and war crimes, is being recognized around the world at the moment more and more. And here I would like to highlight the Center for Civic Liberties and Alexandra Matvichuk, who received this year's Nobel Peace Prize. So they're getting...
Yeah, very good friend of mine, and
Indeed.
I'm very, very happy for Alexandra. It's so well deserved.
Yeah. We hosted her not so long ago at the Institute, and we're really looking forward to hopefully having an opportunity to hosting her again. I'm going to come back to my favorite question of misconceptions, because I feel like I need many hours of therapy after talking to various journalists over the last 9 months and trying to explain what is the difference between Russia and Ukraine. Putin says there is no difference, but there must be some. Tell us what it is. So yeah, let me come back to that question and hear what sort of what sort of main things you had, the main myths you had to dispel, but also what is still there that we need to tackle now.
Yeah, well, I think you, as a historian, can also add a lot of, to this topic, and probably you have your opinions from the point of view of a historian. When again, I'm speaking as a journalist, and well, I've been working as a freelancer with various media outside of Ukraine since 2013, actually late 2013, so the start of the Revolution of Dignity, Maidan Revolution, when I worked mostly with Italian media, and then over the years I kind of expanded my geography and then worked with the Spanish media, with the US, UK, and of course it is easier to work with the media in an English-speaking world, because for all these years since 2014, and this period is very important because so many changes happened in Ukraine over these years, but for many societies and audiences in various countries, kind of the topic of Ukraine disappeared from the radar since 2014, or maybe in the best case scenario in 2015, when the Minsk Accords, the second Minsk Accords were signed. I think it is problematic. Of course, now I will explain why, and why the English-speaking world is an exception, because still there were some reporters, maybe not the bureaus, and this is a problem which is now hopefully will be partially solved, because now the Washington Post has opened the bureau in Kyiv, and finally some Western media are moving even their bureaus from Moscow to Kyiv. So previously there were some reporters from the English-speaking media in Kyiv, well, some of them on a more semi-permanent basis, some of them were almost permanent, some of them visited occasionally. But still there was some reporting on Ukraine, what has been happening in these 8 years in the English-speaking media, which was not the case mostly outside the English-speaking world. Also because, well, this is another issue of the media. They do not have money to do foreign journalism, to have bureaus in, Moscow, again, as a center, again, the center of the region. From Moscow, all the post-Soviet countries, were covered for many, many years. Thankfully, that's starting to change now, but the change is still very slow. So the problem is that, as I said, for all these 8 years or 7 years in the best case scenario, Ukraine was not in the media, and somehow the extent of the fantastic, impressive transformations that happened in Ukraine over these 8 years they were not very much known to the outside world and to the audiences in various countries. So in these 8 years, Ukraine, not only Ukrainian military has undergone a major reform, and we are seeing the results of it now on the battlefield. Well, of course, the Western weapons are making a difference, but also the training of Ukrainian soldiers, which has significantly improved over these 8 years. But also a lot of important reforms in anti-corruption sphere, the anti-corruption infrastructure that has been created, the several anti-corruption bodies that started working, the procurement procedure that has become much more transparent, the media scene that has become even more diverse, and the civil society that produced over these 8 years new leaders who've been active in various spheres. Is it environmental activism, or is it activism against some illegal construction in big cities like Kyiv? So, or is it again advocacy for the judiciary reform? So, a lot of new civil society leaders have come out of age, I would say, in these 8 years, and a lot of reforms, both government launched, but also coming from the grassroots level, were implemented in Ukraine. But that was, not so noticeable. It was not breaking news. So this was maybe evident for someone who lived in Ukraine, who viewed these changes from the inside, but it wasn't that evident to people outside of Ukraine. And I think this also was one of the reasons why erroneously so many officials and experts and the media were predicting that Ukraine will fall in 3 days, that Ukraine will not be able to show resistance, that Ukrainian society is very weak, that Ukrainian institutions are non-functional. Well, and of course Russian, disinformation about Ukraine as a failed state that has been going on for years incessantly. So that's probably the major misconception that was there, since when the full-scale invasion started. And I think those misconceptions are falling and are crumbling out now, with the great rumor and just like falling into pieces. This is really it was eye-opening for, I think, many people across the world, how capable Ukraine was of, showing resistance, and how capable Ukrainian institutions were of ensuring a resemblance of normal life even under constant Russian bombardment, that Ukrainian railways continue to operate, that Ukrainian trains are sometimes, running on schedule better than the trains in the UK.
Sure.
And that, Ukrainian...
Not sometimes, very often, I would say.
And all the other things, that even the educational process somehow continues online, the basements, so like many things that prove that Ukraine, is not a failed state. Yeah, this major misconception that Russia was sowing, it just fell down. Then again, about Ukraine is a very corrupt state, that that officials who would just sell themselves to the highest bidder. We've seen that was not the case, that in many cases in the occupied territories, the local officials didn't leave their communities, they didn't flee. Some of them taking huge risks, some of them actually were killed by Russians. I'm thinking about some villages in Kyiv region where the local council members were just killed, executed by Russians along with their families, because they continued to show loyalty to Ukraine, because they said, we are Ukrainian, we are not going to go anywhere, we'll stay here with our people. So again, this shows you that Ukrainian institutions are not as weak as they were thought to be, and that in the situation of huge pressure and crisis, that things are working. So I think, this is a major misconception. And then about the other misconceptions about, of course, somehow the division of Ukraine along the linguistic or ethnic lines. Yes. That's a huge mistake, to kind of continue saying, I'm hearing that less and less, and hopefully soon it will disappear, that Russian-speaking people in Ukraine necessarily support Russia, or that, being a Russian speaker means political loyalty, which is absolutely not the case. We are seeing how people are resisting in Kharkiv, a largely Russian-speaking city, Kherson, the same, Mykolaiv, Odessa. So everywhere Ukrainian flags in Odessa now. So the fact that one is a Russian speaker does not define one's political loyalties, and this is again another misconception. Then the fact about the Ukrainian identity, that it is mostly ethno-linguistic identity, somehow like very nationalistic, which I think that's another misconception that is just like, disintegrating now, because this war and the Russian full-scale invasion demonstrated that the Ukrainian identity is mostly an identity centered not around the ethnicity or language, because there are many ethnicities in Ukraine.
And many languages.
And many languages, yeah. There are Bulgarians, Greeks, Crimean Tatars, Jews, Romanians, Hungarians, Poles, and many, many others, Swedes, you name it. And they are feeling loyalty to Ukrainian while speaking in their local languages, because their Ukrainian identity is based on a common set of values. And these values are democracy, freedom, human rights. And I think this is something that maybe still not everyone kind of grasps, but hopefully that is starting to change, and that there is this vision of Ukraine as of a country which is much more united than it was portrayed for so many years, and much more resilient and much stronger.
Yeah, and united around the idea of political nation, as you identified. I'm so glad that you highlighted the importance of being present in Ukraine in order to report on the events that are happening on the ground, something that wasn't necessarily the case for international media. But let me bring you back to Ukraine now and Ukrainian journalism. You said a lot of things have changed, and I'd like you to just tell us a little bit what's changed in Ukrainian media and for Ukrainian journalists based in the country. I mean, we've seen some absolutely remarkable reporting from the war zone, from occupied territories throughout the, since the start of the full-scale invasion. But tell us a little bit more about what's changed since 2014, as well as what's changed since February. And what are the main challenges that Ukrainian journalists are facing who are in the country?
Well, I'll try to be brief, although it will be hard.
It should be a separate discussion, really, and we're hoping to have that discussion.
There actually will be. I was working today on a presentation for the University of Oxford. There will be a conference on Ukraine this Friday and Saturday, and I will be speaking there exactly about the impact of full-scale invasion on Ukrainian journalism. So I'll try to highlight like the major findings, the things that I'm going to mention, and this is like a spoiler alert. If anyone is in Oxford or has a desire to come, please do. It's a conference organized by St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford.
My former college.
The best one, I think. Well, at least the one that cares and makes most events about Ukraine, and hosts also some Ukrainian scholars now. So yes, please, you are very welcome to attend this event, and you can register at the University of Oxford St. Anthony's website. I will start my answer by saying that all Ukrainian journalists since February 24th became war reporters, regardless of our background, regardless of our will, regardless of our preparedness. Well, of course, not everyone went to report from the front line. Well, actually, I've never done, and I have to express my sincere admiration of incredible courage of my colleagues who are working on the front lines. So I've been reporting from a basement, in fact, mostly, and not on the front lines. It's not a joke about basement. I made there a workplace with a stable internet connection, so even in case there is an air raid alert, I was able to, do interviews and talk to people and write from there. So I spent a lot of time there, but yeah, I've never been to the front lines. I visited the liberated areas of Kyiv and Chernihiv region in the summer this year, and of course that left a lot of impressions. But I never had an experience of war reporting, and I didn't go to report from the front line. But in a sense, I was anyway a war reporter, like all of my colleagues were, because that was the topic, the only topic that mattered, the only topic that the audience wanted to hear about, and the audience both inside Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. And another thing that changed, and that is specific, I think, for Ukrainian journalists in this situation, which is very different from their foreign colleagues, is that Ukrainian journalists cannot return home from this war, unlike their foreign colleagues who, come to report, and then when they get tired, they can take a break, they can return home. Or even in the evening when, their work day is finished, they can go to for a dinner and then chat and laugh and talk about other things. And Ukrainian journalists can't do that because war is in our home, and we have no other home. We have nowhere to escape from it. Even if we escape or go to the West, like I did eventually, the war is inside us. We carry it inside us everywhere we go, and it never fades away. It's always there, and the pain and the suffering, it's always there. And at the same time, I think it also motivates us to work hard and to do our job even better, and to tell people inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine what is actually happening. Finally the world wants to hear Ukrainian voices. It wants to hear the voices of Ukrainian journalists, which is important. And I think it's remarkable that some of these bureaus of foreign media that are now opening in Kyiv, they are hiring local staff. So finally, these are not the Americans or the Brits who are only working in these bureaus, but there are Ukrainian journalists. I think this is crucial, that Ukrainian journalists do not only work as fixers for the foreign media or producers or translators, but that they finally are writing themselves, they are reporting, and they are making their voices heard because they know this country so much better. And to this, sometimes we can hear a counter-argument that, well, Ukrainian journalists cannot be unbiased because it's their country and they are emotional. I think Ukrainian journalists are very much aware that there might be this perception, and therefore they are even more conscious in being objective and telling the real story.
I'm always, forgive me for interrupting you, but I'm always also keen on highlighting that war is an emotional business, and being emotional doesn't mean that you stop being rational or objective. If you're emotionally invested in this war, I mean, it's totally understandable, isn't it?
I mean, as people, of course, we are emotional, but I think like when, and myself, like when I'm reporting, I'm trying to leave that aside. It's like I'm just like closing kind of that door for a moment, and I'm concentrating on, how journalism is done in order to be credible, in order to be, taken seriously. I think we even have to try maybe harder than our foreign colleagues in this sense. So summing up, like what changed for Ukrainian journalists? Well, obviously, Ukrainian journalists are affected personally by this war. Many of them have lost their loved ones. They lost their homes. Some of the colleagues that I admire from SVOI, it's a regional website, a regional news from Donbas region. They had to flee their homes. So basically, all of the journalists had to leave their homes. They are now scattered all over Ukraine. Some in Dnipro, some in Kyiv, some in Lviv. But they are continuing to report on their region, on Donetsk and Luhansk region, because they have contacts on the ground. It's very important. They have their audience that trust them because they know that they are locals. It's of course like emotionally and physically very difficult, especially now in this conditions of constant blackouts, of internet disruptions and cut water and utilities cut off. It of course it makes the job of Ukrainian journalists more difficult, but I still admire what my colleagues are doing, and of course I want to pay tribute to those colleagues who have been killed in this war. The first person who was killed in Kyiv, a journalist, cameraman Yevgeny Sakun. He was my former colleague. We used to work together on TV more than 10 years ago, and he was killed by a Russian missile close to a TV tower that Russians were trying to destroy on March 1st. And then unfortunately, many other colleagues whom I knew personally and those whom I knew through one or two handshakes were killed in this war. Some of them while doing their work, some of them were killed on the battlefield because they joined the Ukrainian army, they went to fight. Some of them were taken as prisoners of war, like Maxim Butkevich, my very good friend, who had an experience of working here in London at the BBC Ukrainian service, and then worked for many years in journalism and in human rights activism in Ukraine. So we still We, his friends, still don't know about his whereabouts. He's still in Russian captivity. So I just want to, pay tribute to all these colleagues doing an amazing job, either in reporting or on the battlefield, because they felt that they were more useful, they were more needed there than in the newsrooms.
How can we support Ukrainian journalists, apart from obviously reading Ukrainian outlets?
There was a very interesting study, which I quote in my presentation, done by Lviv Media Forum with the support of the FCDO. And they made a survey of 61 media organizations across all regions of Ukraine. So these are local media, with the exception of the occupied Crimea. So they also spoke to news organizations on the occupied territories, or those who had to flee from the occupied territories and who are now continue to operate in other regions of Ukraine. But they are writing mostly about Donetsk, or Luhansk, or Zaporizhia, or Mykolaiv, or Kherson region. And then from this survey, it emerged that the major concern for most of these local news organizations is a financial concern. Mm-hmm. Because of the war, the full-scale war, the advertising revenues have fallen significantly, because obviously the Ukrainian economy has contracted by at least a third this year. And the local newsrooms are those who are suffering the most from the disruption in the advertising revenues. And when they were asked how much money would they need monthly to continue operating, the amounts of money they mentioned were not that huge. So on average, it was about $3,000 per month, mm-hmm. which is not a huge amount. So for local news organizations to continue operating, to continue talking to their local audiences, who again are very important because they trust this local media more than they might trust the nationwide ones. They need very limited resources to survive, and this is their pressing concern. So if I remember correctly, about 79% of news organizations said that the main concern was a financial concern. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, there are safety concerns which relate to missile attacks and the need to evacuate newsrooms and the need to work in these conditions of the blackouts. Well, this is something that is maybe more difficult to help with until Russia stops these attacks. Then another thing that they said they would need is a technical support with some equipment, most of all not protective equipment, so not as much helmets or vests or insurance. That was mentioned too, but they need more. Even more, they need just photo cameras, video cameras. They need sound equipment to continue their work, because many of them were forced to obviously leave all that equipment behind in the territories that were occupied by Russia, or some newsrooms were destroyed as a result of Russian attacks. So they need just this kind of simple, but this equipment is quite expensive, obviously. So that's how I think, based on the survey, based on the needs that these local news organizations expressed, that's how we can help them.
Yeah, fantastic. And this is the last question from me, and I promise I'll open the floor immediately after, so think of your questions, please. You mentioned a few times that you eventually took the decision to leave Ukraine. That was 2 months ago, right? And you joined millions of displaced Ukrainians all over the world now. You've been very honest about your experience and the difficulties, not the practical difficulties necessarily that you experienced in Ukraine, and here there are fewer of those because obviously you don't need to work from the basement, but the emotional side of things and the emotional drain of being away from the country that you work on, that you love, and that you had to leave. You've been honest about it in your posts on social media and elsewhere. So tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind, but also tell us what you think the Ukrainian government should be doing already to ensure that the vast majority of those millions who had to leave the country return when it is safe to do so.
Yeah, well, it was a very difficult decision actually to leave Ukraine, and I applied for this fellowship at the Reuters Institute in Oxford before the full-scale invasion started, so I could not foresee, of course, what was coming. I mean, obviously there were signs of there was a Russian build-up on the Ukrainian borders, but I couldn't imagine the scale of the invasion. Well, I thought, yes, well, something is going to happen, maybe in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and I think that was also the idea that most Ukrainians, at least in the media, shared. So almost no one believed that there will be a full-scale invasion targeting Kyiv, targeting, you know, western part of the country. So when I was applying for this fellowship, it wasn't with an idea, well, I have to get out of Ukraine somehow. It was with the idea, well, you know, I want to do something new, to kind of grow professionally, to have new experience. And when in April I was notified that I was selected for this fellowship, I was happy, but I was also kind of bitter because I really wanted it to happen in different circumstances, you know. I wasn't able to enjoy this news as much as I wanted to because I thought, well, I feel like my place is here. And, you know, I have to continue reporting from Ukraine. Well, I still had some time, obviously, because the fellowship it was starting in October and I arrived in late September. But I'm a mother also. I'm not a journalist, and I have to take into consideration also the needs of my child. And I thought, at least I'm sure that in the UK she will have access to education. She will be able to go to school. She will be able to play with other children. She will be able to communicate with the teachers and have access to education materials, not via a screen of a laptop, but you know, real life. And that was, in a way, something like crucial, I think, which made me like agree to this fellowship and come to the UK. But it's true that in the first 6 weeks, I think about 6 weeks since I arrived, I was feeling lost, very often, like lost, guilty. And I often asked myself a question, well, am I sure that my place is here now? Like, am I doing like the most useful things that I could do from this location? Or it would have been better if I stayed in Ukraine. But it's a very difficult balance, you know. You have to balance your professional life and your private life, and there is no right choice or right solution. It's very different for every person, and some of my colleagues, for example, like also who have children, some of them fled in the very first like days and weeks of war, and they are not able to continue doing journalism anymore because they are stuck in foreign countries on their own. The kids are small. Sometimes they do not even go to school or a kindergarten because it's expensive. I'm now thinking about a colleague in Ireland, for example, who has an 18-month-old daughter and whom I interviewed for this presentation on the impact of war on Ukrainian journalists, and who said, like, I really want to continue working in journalism, but I can't because I tried working during the night. But I very quickly burned out, but I cannot like just combine my childcare duties with my professional, kind of with my desire to remain in the profession. So it's a very difficult choice, and there is no like easy solution. And for millions of Ukrainians, it was not actually a choice. It was something they were forced to do. They were forced to flee, or they were forced to make some difficult compromises. And you always live with this kind of sense of guilt, I think, and at least if not guilt, then maybe a doubt. And was your decision the right one? How to balance again your profession, your passion to, journalism, and all the other things in your life and all the other people in your private life.
Yeah, for sure, and hope that you will be able to return as quickly as you can. Absolutely, great. So we've got at least 2 questions ready already. So gentlemen there, please. Do we have a mic, or shall I give up mine? I'm very happy to give up mine.
Well, first of all, thank you for your talk, and I think you did the right choice coming here. Now you have to make it work, so just do your best. And also, I just use the opportunity to return to this amazing news about Kherson. Some good news, and also it's turned out that actually it's been less than 99% people who supported the referendum. So definitely less than 99% who voted for this, fake referendum in Russia. If you have heard about the news.
Yes.
Okay. Well, anyway, I'm going back, but still there's lots of work to be done. And so my question is, so it's very important thing that we fight this disinformation, the fatigue, so Ukraine fatigue. But to fight something this big and important and nasty, you have to measure it. So how do you quantify fatigue? How do you measure it? How do you track it. So can you please, yeah.
Oh, it's a very good question, and I think it's impossible to measure, obviously. I think we can look at whether it is having any impact, because Russia would, of course, like continue, you know, launching the disinformation campaigns and influence operations and trying to manipulate with the, you know, with the concept of fatigue. But we should look on whether it is having any real life effect. And so far, I think it doesn't have much. It doesn't have much impact in most of the countries of the West that are supporting Ukraine. Well, I'm also, as I mentioned, I have experience of working with the Italian media, and I speak Italian, so I'm monitoring very closely the Italian kind of information space and political scene, because Russia is trying many things in Italy, because it has some like loyal political forces there. It has a lot of loyal forces in the society because of many historical and other financial reasons. And the worrying thing which I notice, and the kind of like a debate in Italy, is this pressure that is being applied, or well, at least actually it is not now. For now, it is not crossing the borders of Italy. Actually, it's not like really reverberating in other countries, or it is not like really reaching Ukraine. But there is this so-called pacifist movement of people who are calling for negotiations immediately, and they are saying, well, Ukraine should be pressured into negotiations because, well, for all different reasons. Some of them are saying because otherwise Russia will use a nuclear bomb. Some others are saying because we cannot, because this is like the maximum that Ukraine could have achieved on the battlefield, so there is no point into like continuing this war on the battlefield. We should like switch into diplomacy rather sooner than later. And also because some of them are saying that it is dangerous to pursue a defeat of Russia, because otherwise if Putin regime collapses, some other regime might come instead that not necessarily would be better than Putin. It might be even worse, or the disintegration of Russia, which would be a disaster. So all sorts of arguments that are being used. And so I'm watching that like very closely, and whether, you know, that like kind of these arguments are starting to be repeated in other countries, crucially in those that are providing most support to Ukraine. So yeah, like this is like, it's impossible to measure, but you can monitor like the narratives and then kind of try to counter them as they emerge, and to present counter arguments.
Yeah, for sure. So the mic, yep, and then
I've got 3 points to make. My wife is Polish, and I just want to make 3 points. One against Russia, one against the EU, and one are observational. If you could sort of respond to them. First thing is, I realise that this attack you mentioned on Ukraine is not just a land grab, it's against the people. Absolutely. And it goes back to Stalin's genocide in the 30s. And I think, you know, Putin is a overhang of the Gulag, and he's a part of the organisation, the NKVD, now called the KGB, that was responsible for the atrocities at the time. And the Holodomor was, the Ukrainians were Stalin's Jews, if we compare that to Hitler with the Jews. And I think that this is a hangover from that. That's the one side. The second thing is they're absolutely disgraceful. I mean, I'm not conned by Putin's false, you know, disinformation anyway. But there's a lot of false disinformation on the other side. Now, there's a lot of honourable help from Poland. Now we see the new Italian governments, Melonius declared for Ukraine. But there's a lot of people in the EU say EU backed Ukraine. No, they did not. From 2014, sorry, and I want comments on this. They were buying Russian oil. They were buying Russian gas. They should damn well have known about the Rhineland in 1936. We should have acted in 2014. And it's quite clear that Russia's bought a lot of power, and blood has been bought with German money, with German and French diplomats. Even now, Macron is now talking to Putin as if he's somebody's buddy down the road. It's disgraceful. And I think the EU has its own disinformation, and they should clear their own closet. Now, I don't want your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying, it's largely boiling down to the issue of impunity. impunity for Russia and for the Soviet Union for the crimes committed by Stalin and by the communist regime. There was never reckoning in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, which is like the state that inherited like all the legacy of the Soviet Union, the UN Security Council seat, and so on and so forth. So there was never reckoning inside Russian society and on the political level with those crimes that were committed during the Soviet times against Ukrainians, but also against other ethnicities, against Russians themselves, you know, all the gulags and all the purges and all the Holodomors and the famine in Kazakhstan and so on. So this, I think, is something, moreover, like the attempts to increasingly in the past 20 years, there was again the cult of Stalin that has been revived in Russia, and you know the crimes that were whitewashed, and the human rights organizations such as Memorial were sidelined and ultimately banned. Like in December last year, it was banned together with the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties and the Belarusian dissident. So the impunity, and since 2014, again, the impunity for the occupation of Crimea, for occupation of some parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the sanctions were weak, and the business as usual with Russia continued. The gas, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and it was normalized. It was almost normalized that, you know, that Crimea was like kind of closed issue. And now when Ukraine is saying that it wants to restore the control over all its territory that in 1991 borders, some people in the West say, well, but Crimea should not be touched. This is the line that shouldn't be crossed because it's a red line for Putin. It's so historically important, but this is all nonsense. So this is not an argument that is compatible with international law. So
absolutely,
the impunity is an issue, and this has to end.
Great, thank you. Ian, please.
Can I just, first of all, say that how much I enjoy reading your Twitter posts.
Thank you.
Excellent, and unlike a lot of what appears on Twitter, which is very, very repetitive, your comments are always very insightful and worth reading. The second thing, in answer to the question posed by Olesya, how you could support independent journalism in Ukraine, one thing which I do in a modest way is to support the Kiev Independent through Patreon. And obviously they need funds in order to be able to keep going. There are a lot of young, enthusiastic journalists whose reporting is excellent, particularly, I would say, Ilya Ponomarenko, who reports as near as possible from the front line and is always spot on as far as I can see. And just a third point, it seems to me, in relation to setting an agenda for negotiations, it seems to me that what I've read of Zelensky's proposals to the G20 meeting in Bali is just the right way to go about this. This is a wonderful forum for Ukraine to get backing for its agenda, not an agenda that's set by, I don't know, pacifists in Germany or Italy or wherever it is, but for the G20 now to back the agenda which has been set by President Zelensky. And if that backing is forthcoming, I think it will be very difficult for Russia and what remains of its allies to set the agenda going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. We'll see what the G20 summit, what kind of declaration they will adopt. It's a very diverse also setting, and we know that some countries, well, Brazil and India and others, might not be as unanimous as the countries of the West, but yeah, and Kyiv Independent is excellent. They just celebrated their first year, so the newspaper, the online media that was founded just 1 year ago, has been doing an amazing job in all this time. So of course, yeah, thank you for your support. And
may I please encourage, we have lots and lots of questions, lots of hands went up. May I please encourage you to keep your questions brief and maybe keep, no, we're here to hear you, and maybe keep your comments for after the discussion when we have a glass of wine. Ursula, please.
Ursula Woolley from the Ukrainian Institute in London. Thank you so much for your talk. Almost everyone I speak to here is fully and wholeheartedly supportive and not tired yet. One or two people, when I speak to them, and they start rehearsing the kind of arguments that you've mentioned that we don't need to go into again, seems to me that they're trying to rationalise their own fatigue. Can we start talking about talks? Really what they're trying to say is, this is too much in my own head. And what do you think about that? So you talked about arguments earlier, but I don't think it's just about arguments. We've been through other political processes in this country where we've reached the same situation and not dealt with the emotion as well as the rationale.
Thank you. So I'm sorry. So what exactly is the question?
Let me see if I can put that a bit more precisely. I think fatigue in individuals is often emotional and psychological. And I'd be really interested in your comment and understanding on, that's our responsibility to deal with here, but any experience that you have on that, I'd be really interested to hear it.
Yeah, okay. So do you want to take one more question?
No, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, you know, I think any person who speaks to a Ukrainian would be very, like, kind of mindful of the fatigue or any attempt to kind of draw their attention away. So I think having this direct contact with the Ukrainians, and now there are a lot of Ukrainians in the UK, and I actually want to thank the people of the UK for welcoming Ukrainians into their homes, for taking care of Ukrainian refugees. That's really remarkable and fantastic. So thank you so much. And so I think, you know, this opportunity also to get to know Ukrainians better is an antidote against the fatigue in a way. And another thing, which I'm also noticing, and I think, Olesya, like, you would agree with me, is that this war and the fact that it was an eye-opener for so many people, you know, who did not know Ukraine, who did not know Ukrainians, it pushed them into a direction of, like, wanting to learn more. And then people maybe not just read the news about Ukraine, they want to, you know more about the Ukrainian culture, about Ukrainian art. And there are some Ukrainian artists in this hall who are, you know, working hard to let the world know what Ukrainian art is. Ukrainian literature, there are people in this room working on that too, on translations. So I think that's also the way to go, to tell, you know, and also Ukrainian history, how we see it, not how Russia sees it, not how this Russian-centric view of Ukraine that was prevalent also in the academia, in the research and academic community for so many decades. Coming, you know, still from the very often still this Cold War vision, Cold War optics, or at least like Russian-centric optics. So hopefully that is starting to change, and more people will, you know, be interested in Ukraine not just as a source of breaking news, but as also a country of very interesting culture, history, arts, and so on.
Thank you, Olga. I suggest we collect a few questions in the cluster now. So, Lesya, and then gentleman here, Suzanne, you had a question, so you didn't. And then, so three, Lesya, gentleman here, and Sasha. And then we'll collect some more.
I work with refugees outside of London, and it's with Syrians, Afghans, as well as Ukrainians, and I was brought in to help with the Ukrainians. And I've recently encountered, or it's growing, the narrative or the Ukrainian fatigue goes something like, well, what about brown people? And this covers everything from people saying, well, the war in Yemen is not being covered anymore, as if there was some sort of competitive suffering going on, right down to people saying, well, people are only helping Ukrainians because they're white, even though Britain has actually had 3 separate settlement programs. But it just seems to be either a thing that's being used to try to take away from the Ukrainian situation, even though when you say, well, this actually impacts poor people around the world even more, and if we could stop this war, it would help everyone. So I was just wondering what you personally have encountered in that vein.
Let's collect a few questions. So, you had your hand up. Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Thanks. Just casting your mind forward, what is your understanding of the expectation of the Ukrainian sort of security and political establishment for post-Putin or post-invasion Russia? So when Putin goes, what is the planning assumption around his replacement?
Great.
That might be.
Thank you, and Sasha. And then I'll come to this part.
Ola, it's such a pleasure and privilege to have you here. Thank you for all your work. I'm just wondering, how do we communicate that it's not only Ukrainian war, it's also a European war, and that listening to Ukrainian voices and taking Ukraine seriously is not a matter of charity, but it's actually a matter of national security for people on this side of the Polish border. Maybe we don't need to communicate this anymore because 2 Russian rockets actually landed on Polish territory today. Maybe rockets speak better than journalists, I don't know. But I'd be very grateful to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Wow, I didn't know that they landed. I saw there was smoke visible from the Polish side of the border, and there is no electricity in Moldova as well, so it's actually crossing. Oh,
there's a gentleman saying that he's got Polish wife, as I understand.
That's me, yes.
Adds his credibility, but I'm Polish 100%. There is no official confirmation. It's very probable that something has landed on Polish territory, killing unfortunately people. That's true.
Article 5?
Waiting for official confirmation.
Wow.
That's true, the Indians in America should wake up and start fighting back at Russia.
Okay.
Well, it's an attack on NATO territory. It might be really okay. Let's not make forecasts, but yeah, it's an attack on NATO territory. Yeah.
Yeah. Currently, it says about the explosion at the village of Shepardov.
Okay. Well, okay. I'll try to remember now the questions,
I've got
and then
them
we'll
written
follow
down.
up with the news.
Yeah. Why Ukrainians? Why special treatment for Ukrainians?
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good question, and this narrative has been prevalent. Well, and not prevalent, but it was there, and it is there. I think since the first Ukrainian refugees started crossing the border. And there were actually some truthful reports of discrimination of people of color who are living in Ukraine, who are trying to leave Ukraine, and that they faced discrimination at the border. So there is like some, as in many disinformation campaigns, there is a grain of truth in that. So we cannot like just discard and say, well, this is just like Russian propaganda or whatever. So there were isolated instances of discrimination of people of color. But I think this, of course, this narrative is being heavily exploited, and as you rightfully said, there is no competition of who is suffering more. And in fact, a lot of people in Africa and in Asia are suffering because of the food shortages, because Russia has blocked Ukrainian ports, and Ukrainian grain is unable to leave the country and to reach people in Yemen and in other countries where people need it desperately. And the rise in inflation in those countries that has also been caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the rising cost of food staples in countries such as Lebanon and elsewhere. So it's a common interest to stop Russia, but of course, like there would be attempts like to manipulate and to somehow present that this is just, well, the world only cares about Ukrainians, and that this war is only limited to Ukraine, as Sasha said. But I think it is crucial to understand that it's actually not just impacts Ukrainians. Ukrainians are fighting and Ukrainians are dying. But the outcome of this war, and, well, God forbid, any Russian success or victory will change the globe, the international system beyond recognition. And I dread to think of how that exchange, how the change might look. It will embolden China. It will empower all the dictators in the world. It will. For democracy, it will mean like really, really bad things. So I don't even want to, project what might happen. So this is not just Ukraine's war, definitely.
What happens when Putin goes?
What happens if Putin goes and when Putin goes? Well, unfortunately, I think nothing will change immediately in Russia after Putin's departure, because it is not just Putin's war. Many Russians support this war. There is no viable Russian opposition, and even the leaders of Russian opposition, they expressed previously some questionable opinions on Ukraine, on Crimea, for example. Navalny was saying that Crimea is not a sandwich to give it back and forth. So we are not seeing a lot of protest demonstrations of Russians who have fled in the past months. So which kind of course, it's again a speculation, but one might conclude that maybe they are not as much against this war that they might share this imperialist vision of Ukraine as an artificial state which doesn't have a right to exist. This is what Russian propaganda has been pushing for many, many years inside Russia. This is also this concept of like somehow funny artificial state with its funny language and inferior to great Russian language and culture. It was present in the Soviet Union as well. Then if we go back in history to the Tsarist times, all the bans on Ukrainian language and the repressions against any Ukrainian attempts to create their own state or to have autonomy or to have any like prominent culture education in Ukrainian language. So all that suppression of anything Ukrainians and the genocide of Ukrainians has been going on for much longer than February 24th. And until this mentality in Russia changes, until there is, as I said earlier, the reckoning with the crimes of the past, the culture of the impunity and the imperialistic vision of Ukraine changes, until then I'm afraid the change is not in Russia is not possible, or it will not be as big and fundamental.
Thank you. I've neglected this part of the room, so lady there and one at the back as well. So just there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I actually wanted to ask two questions. First, on you mentioning about the very successful reforms that Poroshenko started back in 2014 and very successfully conducted with his presidency, and unfortunate failure in the highlighting those reforms and the success and the changes in the society in the non-English speaking countries. And I don't know the reason for that. Probably. Well, you're a journalist. If you could highlight a little bit why that information campaign was a little bit weaker than would be necessary, and what current government can do to actually discuss those reforms and the changes in the society right now, despite of the war. That is the first question, and the second would be basically a continuation on what you have been just discussing, because, well, people. You're so right, and Ukrainians don't need even to discuss among ourselves what should be the end of war. If I ask you right now, outside of this event, you would probably share my views that this is not just gaining back all our sovereign territory and restoring full power of Ukraine, but this is actually the solution of Russia, because you are so right that changing of the leader will not change anything. And Russia having such huge territory and the nuclear power shall be dissolved, shall be dissolved, shall be provided the opportunity for those countries that it.
I have to ask you to focus on the question, please. Thank you.
What would be your opinion on what would be the victory? What would be the solution to this huge, complex world? Actually problem, and I'm so totally grateful for what you've said. So
great, thank you. And another question, the woman at the back, please. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to continue the previous question about using Ukrainians as a tool in order to provide the idea of equality, of, for example, refugees and so on. And this is one of the tools that Russian propaganda can use so that the world fed up from Ukrainians and so on, while probably it is better to unite the idea about the general fight against the totalitarianism or some other problems in the world together. And we saw these examples like a Hong Kong center which helps Ukrainians, or the united protest of Iran people and Ukrainian people on Maidan Nезалежності in Kiev. Do you have some other advices or suggestions how to avoid using Ukrainians as a tool, and maybe to unite our to unite our strengths in order to support these general common ideas, maybe organize some conferences or general hubs or something like that.
Great, thank you very much. Right, please.
Okay, so I really do not want to comment on like how, I don't know, Russia will look like, or whether we should strive to make Russia dissolve, because I want to focus on Ukraine. You know, that's my main area of expertise. And in terms of Ukrainian victory, well, definitely Ukrainian victory would mean the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It will mean the payment of reparations. It will mean the return of all people who have been deported from Ukraine, including 11,000 children, the figure that was mentioned by President Zelensky, who've been deported to Russia and sometimes given for adoption in Russian families. Some of them are having their parents still in Ukraine. So that, and of course the end of impunity, the justice for the victims and survivors of the Russian invasion, and the reckoning, of course, with the previous crimes of the Soviet and Russian Empire, that I would add from myself. But that, of course, it will be very difficult to achieve in practical terms, but that, I think, should be a common goal, that the Russian Empire, and Russia is still an empire, should cease to exist as an empire. So the imperial mindset, the imperial vision of the world. And I think what is actually lacking also in the coverage and in the debates on Ukraine and on this war is that this is again like a war as some wars in the past against the colonial empire, against the empire, and that those countries who have their own experience of colonialism could relate to Ukrainian experience more if they saw it from this angle. I think that's maybe the kind of the angle and the narrative that should be mentioned more often, because in this way we can also win more allies in the global south, in countries like India, in countries like Brazil, in countries like South Africa, where Russia is really having some successes in the information field, in the political sphere, and so on. And to your question, how can we cooperate? Actually, that's one of the answers, to looking for allies in the countries which maybe are not on our side yet, or not fully on Ukraine's side yet. And these are some of the most populous countries of the world, which are also gaining importance. So we shouldn't be only Western focused. Well, of course, the West is now, the support of the West is decisive for Ukraine. But it's also important to speak to people in other parts of the world, in the global south, in these huge countries that are having a lot of influence increasingly, and to explain to them what the Ukrainian struggle is about, so that we do not only have the support of those allies that are already with us, but we also have more support from the countries who maybe know very little about Ukraine, about Ukrainian struggle, about Ukrainian history, about oppression of Ukrainian people on behalf of Russia that lasted for centuries. So by talking more about this, we can win, I think, more allies and avoid the fatigue and whatever.
And just the last round of questions. We've kept you working really, really hard for a very long time, and we will have the opportunity to speak to you informally as well. So there was a gentleman waiting very patiently in the front row here. I'm afraid we won't have time to take more questions than that. Yeah.
Hi, Thomas Brayford. Thank you for your talk. Really interesting. I was interested the most in what you said about disinformation, and I wanted to know your opinions and views on open source journalism. Ellis, Higgins, Bellingcat, what do you think about that? And how effective is it in combating Russian propaganda and disinformation?
Thank you. And there's another gentleman just in the middle, and our Polish diplomat will be the last one. No, just to the right. Yeah, just there. Thank you.
Hi. You have been stressing that this war is about the human rights, the freedom and democracy. And I'm just wondering, after this war, which I expect is going to be over next year, Ukraine has been asking many countries to embargo to Russia, for example, not to export semiconductors, not to buy oil and gas, so their missile can drop or turn around to Russia themselves. And other countries have been following it because of the Ukraine's government's immoral ground. But one day, when the war is over, of course, the government reflects the people's their mind, so that's why they are elected. Well, do you think Ukraine's people have the realization? What's the common concept of embracing this democratic value in the world? For example, in the past, Ukraine is not only a farming country. Ukraine is also a country with highly sophisticated military technology. Will Ukraine continue to export aircraft carrier technology and turbine engine technology to countries in the Far East, which could become a threat to other neighboring countries?
I see. Yeah, and the last question.
Thank you for allowing me to ask the last question. So,
penultimate, it turns out, penultimate question, because I missed the question over there.
Even better. I'm not standing between you and wine. I will once again come back to the gentleman with Polish wife, because I have to say I didn't quite and I will use him as an opening line for the question, because I didn't quite like his comment on you and Germany. Obviously, France and Germany were buying gas and oil, but these were not the only countries, and I can reassure you that there were many more countries.
So we have free speech. I'm entitled to my opinion.
Oil and gas.
We can leave the discussion for a while.
Already ceased to buy that, and Poland is among them, but it might be a long way for some countries. And so now I'm coming back to the question. How Ukrainians see those discussions within, because my gut feelings tells me that you don't like to see the divisions, and as Germany is helping Ukraine, France is helping Germany, maybe in a different way than Poland does, but we're all in the same line, and we're all putting our efforts to your victory. So I would like to hear your comment. Thank you.
And now the definitely final question for the night, just over there, please. Maybe just there. Yeah, thank you.
Very much. So there's one short point and one short question. So as well as a full reconsideration of the hydrocarbon, gas and mineral dependencies, I think there should also be a full reconsideration of London and the financial institutions that enabled Putin and his Czechoslovak to rid Russia and its people of its wealth. The short question really combines your two talents, Olga, and that is journalism and, of course, knowledge of disinformation narratives. Now, whereas you say there isn't full-blown Russian propaganda in most of the Western media, however, do you detect narratives, subtle narratives, creeping into Western reporting, whether it's down to ignorance of political and historical backgrounds, unconscious bias, linguistic imprecision, or sloppiness?
Thank you so much. Do you remember all of them? Would you like me to recap?
Yeah, I remember some of them.
Open source information.
Open source, yeah, great. No, I absolutely respect the work that Bellingcat does. This is the most probably recognizable OSINT community, and now they have a database of Russian war crimes, so they are collecting evidence. And I recently attended a talk by Elliot Higgins who talked about that. And another important thing that the Bellingcat does is that they recently identified people who are operating the missiles that are being launched on Ukraine. The Russian people, there are men and women, who probably just have families and live their normal lives, and who, they actually tracked their social media profiles, so they were like just chatting and sometimes ordering some stuff while they were at work. And very often, actually, in the past, the individuals identified by the Bellingcat were later sanctioned by the EU, for example. So hopefully, this will be the case again, and those individuals will be on sanctions list or brought to justice eventually. But I want to say that Bellingcat are just the most famous ones, but there are also very capable OSINT researchers in Ukraine, such as an informed Napalm community who've been collecting a database of Russian soldiers since 2014. They are not as prominent as the Bellingcat, but they are great in what they do.
Do you remember other questions?
Yeah, there was a question whether Ukraine will continue selling sensitive military technology to some rogue states or the security to the countries which can kind of use it in a not in a good way? That's a very important question, and thank you for this. I think Ukraine should also, of course, Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government and the civil society should reflect more on the mistakes of the past that Ukraine have done, because Ukraine at some point was collaborating with Iran on the nuclear power plants, and some other. Ukraine was selling weapons or technology to some not democratic regimes in the past. I think there should be reckoning with that. At this point in time, I think there should be more awareness of the danger of Chinese interference and economic very strong cooperation with China, which was downplayed, I think, since the Russian full-scale invasion, because there were in the Zelensky government in the recent years some attempts to kind of get closer with China. That at some point China almost bought a Motor Siege plant. The deal that was interrupted in the last moment, as far as I know, because of the US intervention. So hopefully there will be more mindfulness in Ukraine of balances play out. And it's a very heartening news for me as a former foreign reporter, because for so many years, 15 years, I was working very hard as a journalist, as an editor, to kind of inform Ukrainians of what is happening in the world. That's my passion. And hopefully after Ukraine wins this war, foreign reporters like me will be able to report more, and there will be more public interest in our work and more awareness of how the world around us operates.
Divisions within the EU?
Divisions within the EU, the perception in Ukraine. Well, I think, of course, these debates are followed in Ukraine, but in general, I think Ukrainians are sure of the EU support as an entity. So the Ukraine is now a candidate state, and there is a firm support in Brussels. Then on the level of individual countries, that of course varies, because we can not compare the situation in Hungary with the Hungarian government and the situation in Poland or even in Germany, where there were some, let's say, the process was kind of slow at the beginning, but we are seeing now more resolved, at least declarations on behalf of Chancellor Scholz, and more German weapons hopefully will be sent to Ukraine in the nearest future. So I think in general the perception is in Ukraine that the EU is quite united, and there are no reasons at this point to doubt of the EU support.
And then there was the last question about this.
And the question about the creeping disinformation. Well, definitely, yeah. I think as I said before, very often disinformation is not like, because there is this outdated perception of that disinformation is like propaganda or fake news. This is not the case. Very often disinformation is based actually on truth, but then the truths are presented in such a manipulated manner that in the end you have a complete lie, and then the opinion that is being like kind of formed as a result of this writing, reporting. I would not dare to call it reporting, because this is not usually like what journalists do. So definitely there are subtle ways in which Russian disinformation can operate, and sometimes, as you said, journalists can unconsciously repeat some narratives or just use language which is wrong. Well, for example, I do not like when the war is being called the conflict or the Ukrainian crisis. This is like the most terrible. I think most Ukrainians in this room will agree that here in Ukraine, crisis, it just like drives you nuts as a Ukrainian, because crisis, well, yeah, it's an energy crisis, whatever. But this is a war. This is an attempt of genocide. This is not a crisis. Also because it kind of blurs the responsibility in a crisis. Who's responsible? Well, we don't know. Maybe Ukraine, maybe Russia, maybe America. We don't know. So yeah, I think as a journalist, like the use of the words is very important, and I think what is a good thing is that there is more awareness of that, also thanks to the efforts of Ukrainians who I think also kind of lost maybe some of their very cautious attitude that they used to have when confronted with some like Westerners or foreigners. Ukrainians kind of previously, maybe before the full-scale invasion in the public space, were more keen to like hearing, listening, and kind of looking for compromises. Whereas I think since the full-scale invasion, and I think it not just applies to Ukrainians, but also to Poles, to Estonians, to Balts, because so many things that we were warning you about, but you didn't take us seriously, they actually happened, and only then many people kind of recognized and acknowledged, well, those Ukrainians, those Estonians, those Poles, they were right all the time, so maybe we should listen to them more. Yeah. So thankfully this is finally happening, and also Ukrainians are not as afraid of being outspoken, of being vocal, of making their voices heard, and I'm personally very proud of that. Thank you very much.
What a fantastic note to end on, and I think that we need to arrange a meeting with Olga Tokariuk part 2 for sure, and perhaps part 3 as well, given how many questions there are. A marathon indeed. I think we could be here for another couple of hours, but we should definitely let you rest and have a glass of wine, or at least a glass of water, and encourage all of you to stay and speak to us informally. May I please ask you to join me in thanking European Parliament Liaison Office for hosting us tonight and working with us in partnership. I would also like to invite you to our next event here that we will be organizing in partnership with Europe House, which is going to take place on the 25th of November, and it's going to be a conversation between Rory Finnan and James Mick about Crimea specifically, cultural importance, history, literature of Crimea, and how it's really vital for us to remember about Crimea today more than ever. And yes, on that note, let me, all that remains is for me to thank you, Olga, for coming all the way from Oxford tonight, and for sharing
not too far away,
and for sharing so many insights with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming.